Sharyn McCrumb is a best-selling author and resident of the Catawba area in Roanoke County. Named the Virginia Woman of History in 2008 for her contribution to the arts, McCrumb's books, including her so-called Ballad novels and her NASCAR-themed novels, often wind up on the New York Times bestseller list. One, The Rosewood Casket, may become a movie with a big-time director. McCrumb's newest Ballad novel, The Devil Amongst the Lawyers, is set in rural far southwestern Virginia and is based on an actual murder trial in the 1930s. In the book, McCrumb is somewhat critical of those characters who stereotype the people of Appalachia, a battle she fights in real life. The Western North Carolina native, who has won numerous awards, earned a master's at Virginia Tech after earning her undergraduate degree at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Sharyn McCrumb's books have been translated into more than 10 languages. Sharyn McCrumb, welcome to the interview.
Thank you.
First of all, before we get started and talk about your book, what is a ballad novel?
Well, when I originally conceived the term, first of all, the titles come from songs because music is such an integral component of the Appalachian culture, but also because in a ballad, there's a message that people want you to get, and they tend to repeat it several times throughout the ballad. And I do that in books as subplots, so that every book has a theme, and you have about 5 chances to get it.
Mm-hmm. It seems like over the past 10 years or so, Sharyn, that there's been more of an appreciation for Southern storytelling genre, Southern writing. Do you see that, where there's been more of a national appreciation, perhaps, for the craft you apply?
I think Southern writing has always been in the forefront of American literature. We're a storytelling culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it seems like it's getting more publicity or more appreciation, or it just seems like, you know, you don't have to be Southern to read Southern literature anymore.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your newest ballad novel, The Devil Amongst the Lawyers, and really a lot. Quickly, you know, talk about it. It's about a group of reporters that come down from the big city to cover this murder trial, which is based on a true story.
Yes.
And a lot of the book really does not really involve any mystery involving the murder.
No, I don't care who killed Daddy. You would
Right.
have to have an IQ of room temperature to think this was a mystery.
Whether or not the daughter killed her dad. It's really about how people view Southern culture.
It is. It is. This entire book is a study of how the stereotypes originated, because so many of them did originate in the 1930s. That's when Little Abner was invented. That's when you had a lot of those feuding movies come out, and a lot of what we think of as the sort of prototype to the Beverly Hillbillies really was spawned in the 1930s, and part of it was actually because of this real trial. It happened in 1935 in Wise, Virginia, and because the defendant who was accused of killing her father, she was young and beautiful and college educated, and more importantly perhaps, 2 things were happening. One, the Lindbergh trial had just ended. It had sold a lot of newspapers during the Depression, and the newspaper reporters were looking for a new story to sell papers. And they needed a pretty defendant with a cause. Mm-hmm. The second thing that was happening that attracted their attention to Wise was the fact that the movie Trail of the Lonesome Pine was being filmed in Hollywood with Henry Fonda and Fred MacMurray in Technicolor, outdoors. And Trail of the Lonesome Pine was a novel that was set in Wise, Virginia. So the attention of the nation was already on Wise. The thing was, the book was set in 1890. And in 1890, sure, Wise, Virginia had people riding in horse-drawn carriages and wearing long dresses. So did Hoboken.
New Jersey, right.
Exactly.
Right.
But by 1935, we had all moved on to automobiles and telephones and normal 20th century clothes. Well, that's not what America wanted to see. America wanted to see quaint. So when the reporters showed up in Wise and didn't find buggies and bonnets, they wrote the stories to reflect that anyway. I put this scene in the book on purpose. In this scene, Nora Bonesteel, a 13-year-old girl from a rural mountain community in East Tennessee, is taking her first train ride. And people have always stereotyped Appalachia as a place of poverty. And I wanted to remind people that this is not always true. And so this scene, which contains only factual material, is Nora reading a newspaper on the train. Nora had taken the New York newspaper, and on the train, when she'd tired of watching the patchwork of brown fields and silver-limbed trees slide past her window, she began to page through the newspaper, looking for stories that might interest her. She paged through the sports and finance sections in very little time, and spent half an hour looking at the women's pages with its fashion articles and news of famous ladies. She was fascinated by the story of the royal wedding. Prince Henry, a younger son of the King of England, had married Lady Alice in a private chapel at the palace, a quiet wedding on account of the sudden death of the bride's father, the Duke of Buccleuch. The story was interesting to Nora, but she knew she wouldn't be using it for small talk because she had no idea how to pronounce the name of the bride's father. When you read a lot and didn't talk to many people, your pronunciation skills trailed far behind your store of information. It still made her blush to remember her teacher's amusement when she tried to talk about Hurlicues and Don Quixote. She had learned to listen for the word before she tried to enter into a discussion. When she finished the women's pages and began to page through the national news, she found the story on the Morton trial. She felt a shock of recognition seeing her destination talked about in such an important newspaper. And she folded the paper 4 times until it was a small rectangle containing only that one story, so she could give it her full attention. With a shiver of excitement, she settled back in her seat and began to read the reporter's account of the current events in Wise. Her delight soon turned to bewilderment, though, because she wasn't at all sure she was going to the place the writer was describing. Ladies in long skirts and bonnets, folks traveling in a horse and buggy, while the story read like more of a fairy tale than poor Prince Henry's wedding. She wished the lady who had given her the paper had come along on this train because she wanted to ask her if newspapers were allowed to print things that aren't true. Well, she would see the town for herself soon enough. With a sigh, Nora turned to the national news section and began to read an article about a soup kitchen in Chicago where they doled out food to people with no jobs and nobody to help them. It was run by a fellow named Al Capone. She fell asleep, dreaming of those poor, ragged people in Chicago begging for food, and awoke an hour later with tears crusted on her cheeks.
Well, you're extensively on tour with your books, whether it's for the publishing tour or college tours. Do you still run into this with people who ask you about the South, Appalachia? They ask you about, do people wear shoes or things like that? I
get questions that are so dumb. The best one lately, I even put it in the book, was somebody asked me, they said they had heard that trials in Appalachia were still conducted in Gaelic because we had all come over from Scotland and Ireland in 1790, and so surely we still speak our native language. And I said, would you go to a Vietnamese restaurant, please, in whatever town you live in, and talk to those people's children? They've been in this country like 10 years, and already their kids are fluent. Mm-hmm. And you think our ancestors who arrived in 1790 never got the hang of English?
This book is also a little bit of a treatise on beauty, on the perception of beauty and youth, and what that does to influence juries and public opinion, that type of thing. It's something which you see today with the cable news 24/7, where youth and beauty can influence people's opinion.
Oh, yes. This is a shorthand, I think, that started coming on with the image media, when the good guys wore white hats and the bad guys wore black hats in the old Westerns. And we have evolved into a culture of thinking that if you are pretty, you are innocent, that beautiful means good.
Mm-hmm. I've just got about a minute or so left in this segment, but I wanted to talk about another one of your ballad novels, The Rosewood Casket, which was under consideration a while back for a movie.
It's still optioned.
Okay.
Yeah.
You were saying the recession, the money is kind of tight right now, or?
Right. They have to replace the investors they lost when the recession hit. But we still have the director who did Quantum of Solace, the James Bond movie, and The Kite Runner. So he's still on board, and I think it's going to happen.
And I think you brought him to Craig County or something, scouting locations, okay?
Yes.
Okay, so you're still hopeful about that?
Yes, they loved it.
Okay. All right, we're going to take a quick break. This is The Interview. My guest is Sharyn McCrumb. We'll be right back.